There comes a moment in every life when you look around and realize that not every hand reaching toward you is guiding you forward. Some hands steady you, some lift you, and some, without you even noticing, pull you gently away from the very things that keep your soul alive. It doesn't happen with a warning. It begins with a conversation, a joke, a distraction, a whisper that makes you question what you once held sacred. And slowly, almost quietly, your path begins to bend. Have you ever wondered how far a person can drift without realizing it? How one small influence today becomes a shift in direction tomorrow? How a heart that once felt close to God can become clouded, not through rebellion, but through companionship that leads to confusion? We live in a world full of voices, loud ones, charming ones, wounded ones, reckless ones, and every voice has a destination. Some lead you toward peace, others toward emptiness. Some strengthen your faith, others blur it until you can no longer see the road beneath your feet. Before you know it, you are walking a path you never chose, guided by people who never knew your soul's direction. The subtle influence of negative voices rarely arrives with thunder or warning. It creeps in quietly, like a cold breeze slipping through an open window, unnoticed until you begin to shiver. These voices are often gentle, familiar, even comforting at first. They come from people who appear harmless, people you trust, people who sit beside you, laugh with you, and walk with you. Yet their influence works slowly, loosening your grip on faith one small thread at a time. They do not tell you to abandon God outright. They simply plant tiny seeds of doubt in places where faith once stood firm. A raised eyebrow at your prayers, a dismissive smile when you mention blessings, a casual joke that turns sacred beliefs into entertainment. And at first, you brush it off because it seems too small to matter, too light to carry weight. But negative voices speak in repetition, and repetition has a way of reshaping the mind. What was once certain becomes questioned, and what was once clear becomes blurred. You begin to wonder whether your faith is too much, whether your devotion is unnecessary, whether your spiritual path is outdated in a world rushing forward without stopping to breathe. These voices do not push, they pull. They draw you gently away from the quiet places where you once found God. They lure you into conversations where faith feels out of place and silence feels awkward. They invite you into environments where spiritual sensitivity is treated as weakness and belief is mocked as naivety. Their influence is not fierce but persistent, and persistence has its own kind of strength. Each comment chips away at your certainty, each doubt echoed by another voice. Each laugh directed at what you cherish begins to alter your emotional connection to God. You find yourself praying less, not because you stopped believing, but because you started hesitating. You hesitate because those subtle voices have made you self-aware in the wrong way. Instead of focusing on your relationship with the divine, you focus on how others might perceive it. The sacred becomes self-conscious, and self-consciousness is the first step away from sincerity. Yet these negative voices often carry their own wounds. Many of them speak from a place of confusion, disappointment, or unhealed memories. They cloak their pain in clever reasoning or modern logic, convincing you that doubt is smarter than belief and cynicism is wiser than trust. They offer you a worldview where faith has no place because they themselves have lost the courage to search for meaning. They encourage you to live only for what you can see and touch, telling you that the invisible holds no power. But the invisible is where your soul breathes, and the soul suffocates long before the body does. When you let these voices guide you, you walk toward a dimmer world without realizing how bright your life used to be. Their influence moves you away from gratitude, replacing it with skepticism. It moves you away from prayer, replacing it with distraction. It shifts your heart from reflection to restlessness, from trust to uncertainty, from spiritual fullness to emotional fatigue. The most dangerous part is that these voices often appear rational. They wrapped out in charm, sarcasm, or intellect. They make you question whether your connection to God is genuine or simply a story you inherited. They make spiritual truth seem optional, something that can be postponed, something you can pick up again when life becomes difficult. But postponing faith is itself a quiet form of abandoning it, because the heart grows accustomed to living without what it does not regularly touch. Over time, their influence becomes your inner voice. You start to repeat their doubts in your own thoughts. You mimic their reasoning. You echo their disbelief. And when someone else speaks faith to you, it feels unfamiliar, as though they are speaking a language you once knew but no longer remember fluently. The subtle influence of negative voices is powerful because it does not fight your faith directly, it erodes it gently. It convinces you that distance from God is harmless, that drifting is natural, that questioning is the same as seeking. But drifting is not seeking, and questioning without the desire for truth becomes a trap. The people who turn you away from God rarely hold weapons. They hold conversations, casual comments, shared doubts, and quiet cynicism that settle into your mind. What they offer feels easier than faith, because faith requires intention, while drifting requires nothing. Negative voices thrive on your inattention. They grow in spaces where you stop guarding your heart, where prayer becomes rare, where gratitude becomes casual, and where spiritual awareness becomes blurred by noise. Their influence works best when you forget how valuable your connection to God truly is. People who mock your faith or belittle your beliefs do more damage than they appear capable of, not because their words are sharp, but because they settle into the quiet corners of your mind where insecurity often hides. Mockery has a way of echoing long after the voice has gone silent. It wraps itself around your confidence and squeezes it gently until you begin to question what once felt unshakable. When someone laughs at your devotion or reduces your relationship with God to superstition or weakness, they introduce a fracture into the foundation of your belief. At first, you may shrug it off, pretending it does not matter. You tell yourself their words carry no weight, but something inside you shifts. You begin to examine your faith through their eyes instead of your own, and in that moment your spiritual posture changes. Instead of standing firm, you start adjusting yourself to avoid their judgment. Mockery wears many disguises. Sometimes it is loud and obvious, the kind that turns sacred rituals into punchlines or paints prayer as unnecessary. Other times it arrives softly, through sarcasm or subtle comments slipped into conversations meant to sound harmless. A smirk during a moment of gratitude, a joke at the expense of your values, a comment questioning why you live differently from the crowd. Each moment chips away at your inner certainty. You begin to hesitate before speaking about God or sharing a spiritual experience because you fear being misunderstood or ridiculed. Silence becomes your shield, but it is also the very thing that weakens your connection to the divine. Faith grows when expressed and lived. It dims when hidden in the shadows of embarrassment. People who belittle your beliefs often carry a conviction of their own, but it is a conviction built on disbelief rather than faith. They approach life through a lens that sees only what is tangible. They consider spiritual devotion to be outdated or naive. When they encounter someone who believes deeply, it challenges the stability of their worldview, and rather than face the discomfort of self-examination, they turn to mockery as a defense mechanism. Their laughter is not always a sign of superiority. It is often a sign of fear that faith holds something they have lost. Fear that belief might require them to confront parts of themselves they have been avoiding. Fear that God may still be calling them, even when they pretend not to hear. But instead of acknowledging that inner conflict, they try to pull others into their emptiness, hoping shared doubt will make them feel less alone. When your beliefs are mocked long enough, you begin to internalize the voice of the one who mocks. Their criticism becomes your hesitation. Their sarcasm becomes your inner conflict. Their dismissal becomes your self-doubt. You start to wonder whether faith is truly necessary, whether devotion is worth the effort, whether prayer actually changes anything. What used to bring you comfort now feels fragile, as if it could be broken by a single comment. This inner erosion is subtle but steady. You drift farther from the peace you once felt, not because God walked away, but because you allowed someone else's laughter to speak louder than your own spiritual experience. Mockery has another effect. It makes you want to blend in. You begin to shape yourself according to the expectations of those who belittle you. You tone down your faith, shorten your prayers, hide your gratitude, avoid spiritual conversations. You choose conformity over conviction because conformity feels safe in the presence of mockery. But safety built on denial is not safety at all. It is a slow suffocation of the soul. When you silence your beliefs to avoid judgment, you silence a part of your identity. You distance yourself from the very relationship that gives you strength, guidance, purpose, and clarity. The saddest part is that people who mock your faith often do it without understanding what they are destroying. They may not know how long it took you to build your connection to God, how many nights you spent praying for answers, healing, strength, or forgiveness. To them, it is just a comment. To you, it shakes the foundation of something sacred. Over time, this emotional conflict makes you feel stuck between two worlds, the world that aligns with your soul and the world that demands your silence. And standing in the middle drains you spiritually. You lose the fullness of true belief without gaining any of the peace that mockers claim to have. In the end, people who belittle your beliefs are not enemies of your faith because they are powerful, but because you give their voices a place inside your mind. When their mockery becomes familiar, it begins to sound reasonable. When their laughter becomes normal, it begins to sound true. And slowly you drift away from God, not because you stopped believing, but because you started believing that their voices mattered more than your spiritual truth. People who celebrate darkness over light rarely introduce themselves as harmful influences. They often appear exciting, confident, or free-spirited, drawing you in with a sense of thrill that feels refreshing at first. Their way of living seems bold, unbothered by consequences, untouched by guilt. They carry an energy that whispers, life should be lived without restraint, without restrictions, without the quiet discipline that faith teaches. And in their presence you may begin to feel that your spiritual commitment is old-fashioned, too slow for the world they present. Their celebration of darkness is not always obvious. It can come dressed in charm, humor, or a sense of rebellion that makes you question whether choosing light is limiting you rather than protecting you. People like this normalize actions that chip away at the conscience. They turn reckless choices into entertainment, harmful behaviors into lifestyle, and moral boundaries into jokes. They speak as though nothing is sacred, nothing is meaningful, nothing is connected to something higher. That heavy emptiness they carry is disguised beneath loud laughter and glittering confidence. When you spend enough time around them, something begins to shift inside you. What once felt wrong becomes less shocking. What once stirred your conscience now barely moves it. They do not force you to step into darkness. They simply make it look harmless. They make it look fun. They make it look like freedom. But their version of freedom is really escape from accountability, from truth, from inner wounds they do not want to face. Their influence works slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground as the sun lowers. You may not even notice it happening. One compromise leads to another. One ignored conviction becomes a habit. One moment of going along with the crowd becomes a new normal. These individuals often push you toward choices that numb your spiritual sensitivity. They encourage a life that is louder on the outside but emptier on the inside. They urge you to silence your conscience, to loosen your values, to treat your connection with God as something optional rather than essential. And because their voices are confident and constant, you begin to believe them. You begin to think that living lightly means living without light. What makes their influence even stronger is the sense of belonging they offer. They make you feel included, understood, unjudged. They accept you, not because they truly value your soul, but because your presence helps them avoid confronting their own inner silence. People who celebrate darkness often seek company in their choices because being alone would reveal the emptiness they are trying to hide. And when you feel welcome, it becomes harder to walk away, harder to choose a different path, harder to acknowledge that their influence is leading you toward a spiritual numbness you never intended to embrace. Over time, you may start to feel a quiet conflict inside. Something feels missing. You lose the peace you once felt in God's presence. You lose the clarity that used to guide you. The stillness of your heart becomes replaced with noise that never settles. Even in moments of excitement, there is a flicker of emptiness that no amount of distraction can fill. This is the consequence of walking too closely with people who celebrate darkness. You begin to adopt their rhythm, their breathing, their way of seeing life. The world loses its depth. Gratitude feels unnatural. Prayer feels distant. And the spiritual light inside you, once steady and warm, begins to dim not because it died, but because you turned away from the source that fed it. People who encourage darkness are not always malicious. Many are lost souls searching for meaning in all the wrong places. They cling to temporary pleasures because permanent peace feels unreachable. They chase extremes because stillness reminds them of the truth they are running from. Their laughter is often a mask. Their confidence is often a performance. Their celebrations are often an attempt to drown out the quiet voice of conscience that still whispers in their moments of solitude. But if you follow their path long enough, you begin to carry the same emptiness, the same restlessness, the same hunger that no earthly thrill can satisfy. Darkness disguised as entertainment is the most dangerous kind because it invites you to participate without questioning the cost. It convinces you that you have nothing to lose when in reality you are losing something sacred, your spiritual grounding, your clarity, your connection with God. And by the time you realize it, the distance you've created feels wider than you imagine. This is why people who celebrate darkness can turn you away from God so quietly and so completely. They don't push, they pull. They don't argue, they influence. They don't confront your faith. They distract you from it until distraction becomes detachment and detachment becomes absence. Companions who distract rather than guide are often the hardest to recognize because they do not come with warnings or harmful intentions. They usually care for you in their own way, enjoy your company, and bring moments of joy or laughter, yet their presence gently pulls you away from the path that keeps you close to God. These individuals are not enemies of your faith. They are simply lost themselves. They wander through life without direction, without spiritual grounding, and without the awareness that their habits and choices slowly influence the people around them. When you spend time with someone who carries no sense of higher purpose, you begin to absorb the rhythm of their living. You start mirroring their patterns, their priorities, their distractions, and gradually, without noticing, you shift away from your own spiritual commitments. Their distraction begins in small, innocent ways. They convince you to skip moments of reflection because there is something more entertaining to do. They interrupt quiet thoughts with noise, replace prayer with plans, and fill your schedule with activities that leave no room for connection with God. Even when you want to pause and reconnect spiritually, their energy pulls you back into motion. They do not mock your faith, and they do not turn you toward darkness intentionally. Instead, they simply lead you into a life where God is no longer at the center, not because you rejected Him, but because you got too busy, too distracted, too caught up in everything else. People like this live for the moment. They rush from one excitement to another, one problem to another, rarely stopping to breathe or search for meaning. When you walk beside them long enough, you begin to match their pace. You forget the quiet places where you once found peace. You forget the stillness that used to strengthen your soul. You forget the gentle discipline that kept your heart aligned with what mattered. Spiritual disconnection does not always happen through sin or rebellion. Sometimes it happens through noise, business, and constant movement. And companions who distract you create a life filled with so much activity that you lose sight of the presence that once guided you. Their influence also affects the way you think about time. Instead of valuing moments of renewal and reflection, you begin to treat them as interruptions. You start to believe that staying spiritually grounded can wait. You postpone your devotion, telling yourself you'll come back to it when things slow down. But things never slow down when you walk with people who never pause. Days blur into nights, and the heart grows accustomed to running instead of listening. The more you run, the more distant God feels, not because he stepped away, but because you stopped turning toward him. Companions who distract you rarely understand what they are taking from you, because they cannot see what they themselves are missing. They feel the same emptiness you begin to sense, but instead of confronting it, they drown it in constant activity. They distract themselves to avoid their own spiritual hunger. And when you stay close to them, you begin using the same distractions to avoid your own inner whispers. Their lifestyle normalizes avoidance. It teaches you to escape uncomfortable truths, to focus on temporary pleasures, to ignore the quiet calling of your soul. And every time you choose distraction over depth, you take one more small step away from the spiritual clarity that once guided your life. There is also a quiet emotional effect that grows over time. When you remove God from the center of your decisions, uncertainty begins to fill the empty space. You feel unsettled, but you cannot explain why. You feel drained, but you do not know what you are missing. Your heart becomes heavy with a kind of longing that everyday activities cannot soothe. This emotional fatigue is the silent sign that distraction has taken hold. And companions who live in distraction do not help you find the cause. They help you ignore it further. They offer more noise, more movement, more temporary thrills to cover the spiritual discomfort you feel within. What makes their influence particularly dangerous is that they can be kind, supportive, and loyal in many ways. They do not wish you harm. They simply do not know how to nourish your soul. They walk with you in the world but cannot walk with you toward God. Their footsteps lead you toward earthly comfort, not spiritual growth. If you follow them too closely, you begin to lose the balance between enjoying life and remembering its higher purpose. And once that balance is gone, you wake up one day wondering how you drifted so far without meaning to. These companions become anchors that hold you to a life of constant distraction. They keep you busy enough to forget what your soul truly needs. They help you avoid pain but also keep you from healing. They fill your time but empty your spirit. And slowly, gently, unknowingly, they turn you away from God, not through pressure or persuasion, but simply through a life lived without Him. People who carry hidden bitterness toward God often do not reveal their wounds openly. Their pain lives quietly beneath the surface, tucked behind polite conversations, forced smiles, and stories they never finish telling. Somewhere in their past, their faith was shaken by loss, disappointment, unanswered prayers, or a moment that felt like abandonment. Because they never healed from that moment, they now speak through the voice of their wound. And when someone speaks from an unhealed place, their bitterness becomes contagious, spreading through subtle comments and quiet confessions that begin to reshape how you see God. They are not trying to turn you away on purpose. They are trying to survive the ache they still carry, but in doing so they lead others into the same confusion that consumed them. Bitterness is heavy, and people who carry it often want someone to share the weight. They may question your faith gently at first, asking why you believe, why you pray, why you trust. Their questions sound honest, even thoughtful, but behind those questions is a storm they have never faced. They interpret life through disappointment, so everything they speak is colored by it. When they hear about your blessings, they quietly compare them to their own lack. When you talk about answered prayers, they remember their unanswered ones. Their bitterness makes them feel as though God favors others more, listens to others more, loves others more. And because this belief is too painful to hold alone, they begin to share it with you in pieces, wrapped in conversation, softened with emotion. Slowly, without realizing, bitterness becomes a lens they hand to you, and you start seeing God through their heartbreak instead of your own experience. These individuals often tell stories that highlight their pain. They speak of moments they felt betrayed by life, moments where they begged for relief that never came, moments where everything they trusted collapsed at their feet. Their vulnerability draws you in, and your compassion makes you listen closely. But in listening, you begin to absorb their emotional interpretation of God, a God who is distant, unpredictable, selective, or silent. They might not say these words directly, yet their tone, their expressions, their sadness all imply a version of God shaped by their sorrow. You start comparing their experience with your own, and doubt begins to settle quietly. You wonder whether your faith is too optimistic, whether your trust is misplaced, whether your devotion is fragile and waiting to break the way theirs once did. Bitterness does not attack faith loudly. It slips in through empathy. When you care for someone, their pain affects you. When you try to understand them, their worldview influences yours. And when their wounds speak louder than their hope, you begin to echo their doubts without noticing. These individuals often question the meaning of suffering, the fairness of life, and the silence of God. Their questions are sincere but heavy, and when you hold them too long, your heart begins to feel the same heaviness. Bitterness spreads not through anger, but through exhaustion. It makes you spiritually tired. It makes you emotionally drained. It makes you wonder whether trusting God requires more strength than you have. People who carry hidden bitterness often lose the ability to see blessings clearly. They remember every disappointment but forget every protection, every moment of mercy, every quiet miracle that unfolded without announcement. Their memory is shaped by pain, and when they speak to you, they invite you into that same selective remembering. You begin to notice what went wrong instead of what went right. You begin to focus on delays rather than guidance, on silence rather than presence, on prayers still waiting rather than those already answered. In this way, their bitterness becomes a filter through which you start interpreting your own life. The danger is not in the person, but in the weight of the emotions they carry. If you do not guard your heart, you will begin to mirror their disappointment. You will start believing God works inconsistently, that He favors some and ignores others, that your faith is not strong enough to earn His attention. These beliefs do not come from truth but from emotional wounds dressed as wisdom. And once your spiritual understanding is shaped by someone else's pain, your relationship with God begins to shift. Prayer becomes uncertain. Gratitude becomes restrained. Trust becomes fragile. You begin to hold God at a distance, not because He failed you, but because someone else's heartbreak convinced you to. People with hidden bitterness toward God need compassion, understanding, and healing, but they also require boundaries. Their pain deserves empathy, but your soul deserves protection. Because bitterness is powerful, it can reshape your hope, weaken your certainty, and dim the light within you. And without realizing it, their unresolved wounds gently turn you away from God by making you fear the same disappointment they endured. Voices that promise freedom, but lead to emptiness, often speak with confidence, charm, and a sense of bold independence that can feel inspiring at first. They present themselves as liberators, as people who have broken free from traditions, boundaries, and responsibilities. They talk about life as if it should be lived without rules, without restraint, without any higher accountability. Their message is simple: do whatever you want, follow your impulses, listen only to yourself, and reject anything that limits your desires. They tell you that walking away from God is not losing guidance, but gaining control, not losing structure, but finding independence, not losing purpose, but discovering your own truth. Their words sparkle with a kind of courage that seems attractive, but beneath that shimmer lies a quiet hollowness they never mention. These voices paint faith as confinement. They say that belief restricts your freedom, that devotion is outdated, that spiritual discipline steals joy rather than protects it. They speak as if life should be shaped by impulses alone, as if responsibility is a burden, as if commitment is a chain. When they talk about freedom, they talk about escape from rules, escape from accountability, escape from reflection. And because their words are wrapped in confidence, They can make you question whether you are missing out on something by staying close to God. They appeal to the part of you that longs for autonomy, that craves simplicity, that sometimes wishes life came without spiritual struggle or moral effort. But their version of freedom is only the surface of something much deeper and much emptier. True freedom lifts the soul, false freedom drains it. The independence they offer feels thrilling for a moment, but it leaves behind a silence that feels too heavy, too deep, too cold. When you follow their path, you may feel unburdened at first. You may feel like you are stepping into a world without expectations and without pressure. But soon the thrill fades and you are left with choices that brought temporary pleasure but long-term emptiness. This emptiness grows slowly, settling into the heart like dust, until you begin to feel disconnected from your own purpose, your own peace, your own identity. Voices that lead you away from God often speak of self-discovery, but they guide you into a version of yourself disconnected from the one who created you. They tell you to follow your heart, but never remind you that an unanchored heart is easily deceived. They tell you to trust your instincts, but never admit that instincts shaped by confusion and distraction often lead astray. They celebrate a life lived without boundaries and call it empowerment, but empowerment without wisdom becomes recklessness. They promise you a life without spiritual responsibility, but that life quickly becomes a life without direction. People who talk this way often carry a hidden emptiness themselves. They mask it with confidence and call it enlightenment. They mask it with adventure and call it growth. They mask it with indulgence and call it freedom. But deep inside, they feel the quiet ache of a soul unanchored. They distract themselves with desires because they fear what they might hear in silence. Silence reveals truth, and truth reveals longing, a longing they have been trying to outrun. And when they convince others to follow their path, it validates their choices. It reassures them that they are not alone in their wandering. It comforts them to see others drift away from God, not because they wish harm, but because your drift normalizes their distance. However, when you embrace the freedom they offer, you begin to lose the quiet strength that comes from belonging to something greater than yourself. You begin to lose the clarity that comes from surrender. You begin to lose the balance that comes from spiritual guidance. Choices become heavier. Emotions become louder. Peace becomes harder to find. And the more you chase their version of freedom, the further you drift into a space where nothing feels stable anymore. You may wake up one day feeling like you gained the world's permission but lost your soul's direction. The danger of these voices lies in how convincing they sound. They do not push you away from God. They persuade you gently, telling you that faith is optional, that God is distant, that your spiritual hunger is something you can silence. They promise fulfillment through self-reliance, yet self-reliance without spiritual grounding becomes a burden too heavy to carry. They promise happiness through indulgence, yet indulgence without purpose becomes a craving that never ends. They promise freedom through detachment, yet detachment from God becomes detachment from peace itself. In the end, their promises dissolve into emptiness. What they offer cannot sustain a soul. It cannot comfort in pain, cannot guide in confusion, cannot strengthen in weakness. It leaves you wandering, searching, aching for something deeper. And by the time you realize that their version of freedom was only a disguise for spiritual hunger, you may find yourself far from God, not because you stopped believing in Him, but because you believed too easily in voices that made emptiness look like liberation. In the end, the greatest danger is not found in enemies who oppose your faith openly, but in the quiet influences that slowly turn your heart in another direction. The people who plant doubt with smiles, those who mock belief as if it is fragile, those who celebrate darkness as though it is freedom, those who distract you with empty noise, those whose wounds shape your understanding of God, and those who promise independence but leave you empty. All of them remind us how delicate the human soul can be. Faith is not stolen in a single moment. It is surrendered when we stop noticing how far we've drifted. And so we must learn to pause to listen, to guard the soft places of our hearts where God still whispers. We must choose our influences with care, remembering that the company we keep quietly shapes the path we walk. Stay close to those who encourage your spirit, who remind you of light when the world grows dim, who help you hold on to faith even when your hands feel weak. For in a world filled with voices, the most important choice you will ever make is the one that decides which voice becomes your guide. Thank you for listening with an open heart and for giving space to words meant to strengthen your spirit. May this message guide you toward clarity, courage, and deeper faith. I wish you good luck on your journey. May every step draw you closer to peace, closer to purpose, and closer to God's unwavering light. May you be protected from the voices that distract you, and may you always recognize the ones that lead you home. Thank you, and may blessings follow you wherever you go.